Good morning. Thank you very much for allowing me to share a piece of your morning with you. I'm going to do it fast, but Maria Therese asked me to come here today and talk a little bit about how we see innovation changing, and we being a group of people between a business school in Switzerland, IMD, and a business school at MIT, Sloan School. And we've been working together for, 16 years or so, looking at the patterns of innovation and doing it through a program. I'll tell you about it in a few minutes. But what we're seeing is fundamental changes. You've described them, the previous speakers have described them in terms of the way in which they're clustering firms and the way in which they're transferring technology. But part of the broader question is, how is it affecting the way you work? So, how does this look compared to where you work? Some of us started our careers in places like that. Now, I may be the oldest person in the room, but I started as a development engineer in the steel industry. Sure looked a lot like that. I mean, it wasn't all that different. And I think part of what I want to do is to get you to think about not necessarily the technologies that are changing, because you know those, but how you're changing, how the way you work changes, how the way you make decisions change, how you as a professional change the way you get ideas and work with them. So if I take that and I ask you, does your organization look like this, or one of the more fanciful cloud organizations where everything's fluid and agile, what would you vote for? And I'm not asking for a show of hands, but I'd like you to think about, where are we in terms of the way in which we work? How many of you use the funnel to describe the innovation process? Remember the funnel? That the movement of ideas from discovery to launch, the commercialization process, and the shrinking of time to market. How many of you are working in processes that are essentially linear and sequential, still today, right? How many of you think about long-term and short-term revolutionary incremental innovation strategically when you think about your portfolios? How many of you think about innovation, and I'm really talking about innovation, although I think invention is quickly becoming part of this. How many of you think about innovation as a noun, as a title, something that somebody does, someone else does it, some department, some group, rather than as a verb that characterizes the way in which you work, right? Simple questions, right? All of which I think are warning signals about legacy thinking. I think that we have to not only change the technologies that we insert into our lives, but we have to change ourselves as well. And that's harder to do. In fact, if you think about it, we've always had disruptive innovation, right? Ever since the Industrial Revolution, but it's been slower in a different cadence. And it's periodically influenced the way the world works. We've gone from steam to automotive rail technologies, to petrochemicals, to automobiles, to computers. But now the pace is getting faster. And if you think about your own life and you think about these icons as symbols of technologies that you used intimately as part of what you did and how you did it, and they're all gone or imperiled, you begin to see that our time, the time we work in today, I think, is changing faster and more profoundly than ever before. Now, probably every generation has said the same thing, but I think we have a good case to make at this point in time, and I think we've only seen the beginning of it. I think the advent of genomic research and the Internet of Things, and the fact that they're both going to really blossom at the same time is going to really change the way in which we think about your jobs, my job, the way in which technology influences society, and who we are as individuals or idea workers in this. So what I'd like to think about is that, how does technology change relatively to human adaptability, excuse me. And I think we're here in terms of our technological reality. And, organizationally, we're there. And we feel it in the way in which things work or don't work, and the things in which we have to do. Incidentally, this chart originally comes from Astrotella, who runs Google X. But it comes from a book by Tom Friedman, the journalist who writes for the New York Times. And Friedman's title of the book is Thank You for Being Late, because he says that the only time he gets to think anymore is when somebody's late for a meeting. So the book is dedicated to all those people who failed to show up on time and allowed him the time to work on the book. And I think that, there's something in that. The problem is that this gap is never going to actually narrow in our lifetime. So unless we change the way we do it or how we do it. So do any of you feel stressed at work? Do any of you feel like the pace of change is accelerating? Do any of you feel like it's almost becoming overwhelming? I see people nodding and smiling. So here's what I'd like you to do. Just for a minute, I'd like you to just close your eyes and take a deep breath and savor this moment, because it's never going to get any better. It's never going to get any slower. It's never going to get any less complex. Why would it? What do you think is going to stop changing? Right? So clearly this is, an untenable situation, but a situation that's not optional. It's one that we have to somehow come to grips with. And I think what it means is changing the way in which we work and think about ourselves in an innovation reality. So I think changes took me days to do that. Change is continuous. But organizational life is episodic. And that's a problem. That's a disconnect that somehow we have to broach. So when I talked about the funnel was linear and slow, right? When I talked about that sequential process, it's just building inefficiencies into getting things done. When I talked about portfolio based around long-term or short-term or revolutionary incremental, those are luxuries we used to have in the past. And the I'm not speaking well today, I don't know what's happened, but forgive me, but the collapsing of time, which you'll see in a few minutes, is leaving us with less opportunity to make those sorts of distinctions. We have to do all of them, and we have to do all of them now. So it has profound impact on how we work. I love it. So let me start out by trying to build a case for this. So innovation is an industry phenomenon, I think, or at least disruptive innovation is an industry phenomenon. It's always occurred in distinctive generations of output. We used to, when I first started as an engineer, we used to measure these S-curves as levels of functional achievement. We would look at how devices would perform and predict what we would have to do in the future. Then later we thought of them as industry change, because one of the things we noticed is that firms that succeeded in this generation, I don't know if you can see this, in this first generation, almost never made it to the second generation. And firms that succeeded in the second generation almost never made it to the third generation. Are there exceptions? Yes, but not a lot. And those of us who are academics in the room, man, we're the lucky ones, because we've had one S-curve our entire life. It's the slowest, most change-resistant S-curve in the universe. But even that one is being imperiled now. And the people who are threatening it are not our traditional rivals or our peer institutions who we cooperated with and competed with. They're other people. They're different people from different backgrounds playing by different rules. And they have different expectations than what we've had in the past. And you see it affecting publishing. You see it affecting careers. You see it affecting funds. The academic landscape is going to change within the lifetime of most of the people in this room, profoundly. So sustain oneself, an organization, be it academic or industrial, had to jump from one curve to another. And that's why change has always been continuous, because we've always had to make those changes. But for most of us, or for the people who are running most institutions, they joined an S-curve with the expectation that they would remain in it for their entire career. And they would not have to worry about the disruption between that and what comes next. And they were probably right. But that's unlikely to be the case for people who are joining those organizations today. So already there are differences in perceptions of the way in which time works between the top of organizations and the bottom. And we have all sorts of terms for that. We stereotype those people as being disloyal or being, disengaged, but in fact, they're operating under a different set of expectations, because when they look at the world around them, they see change happening more frequently and more profoundly than we have in our generation. So industries are disrupted, not firms. Firms are swept away in the carnage, but industries get disrupted. So one of the things that's interesting to be in a business school is when we talk to people, one of the things they want to do is they want to be benchmark or best practice sharing. But what they're doing is they're doing that with organizations that are going to go away at the same time they do. So when you looked at, forgive me for using the familiar, you looked at Nokia, what about Sony Ericsson? Right? What about Motorola? They disappeared at the same time. When you look at Kodak, we never talk about the film business at Fujifilm or AGFA, but they disappeared at the same time. They were all benchmarking against each other. They were all comparing against each other. They were looking in the wrong places. They were looking for signals and ideas in the wrong places. That's not where change was going to come from. So think about this. You're all familiar with, everybody in the room has used probably most of these devices. You've seen change in products. Each one of these changes from vinyl discs on has had an S-curve of its own. Incidentally, that's a lot of change. That's about 7 big revolutions in your lifetime in the way in which you've accessed music. It's probably why you have multiple copies in different formats of music that you like. But what's also interesting is that each of these industry generations has been dominated by a different firm, because they were not among the incumbent market leaders. And so they had more freedom and more legitimacy to change than the ones who had to defend particular positions. How many of you stream right now? Everybody streams? Okay. So the big streaming players are Pandora, Spotify, YouTube, and Apple. Who do you think's the biggest streamer? Spotify? It's YouTube. And the interesting thing about YouTube is that almost all of their offerings are free. So not only are they big and successful, but it's hard to compete in pricing against them, because they're essentially giving away. They're making some changes around the edges in that model. Everybody streams. What comes next? So we don't know, right? But if you look at the time periods between how long vinyl discs lasted, and then how long the Sony Walkman lasted, and then how long you had an iPod, and then how long you've been streaming, one of the things you see is that time is getting progressively shorter. And what that means is that those ruptures are occurring more frequently than they used to do. So we didn't have to worry about them in the past because they were infrequent. But increasingly, we're seeing the ruptures appear. And that calls for a different type of decision-making, different type of thought process. When I asked you what comes after streaming and you didn't know, that's the unknown. We in the room, I think, are collectively good at the uncertain. So what does this mean? So we're all familiar with the taxi business, and we know how it works, and it doesn't matter what city you're in, and we all know what's happening with Uber, and you go to any city, and it's more or less the same thing. Is Uber the same as a taxi? No, not exactly, but it's close enough that I can sort of figure it out, right? I might have to make some different assumptions, but I can do that. So last year I was walking across the Thames in May in London, and there was a guy water skiing. He had a wetsuit on. Weather was cold. It was sort of ridiculous. But what was really interesting was there was no boat. There was no boat pulling him around. What there was a drone. And up until then, I had no idea that drones could pull people for such an extended period of time, or that they had battery lives that could do that. By chance, the next day, I met a guy who was producing these. This is a firm in Shenzhen, and he had just received an order for 10,000 of these, it turns out, from Uber. Now, I might be able to understand this industry based on that, but there's no way I can understand that industry based on this. So I can't make predictions, I can't make assumptions, I don't know what the value chain looks like, I'm not sure who the customers are, I don't know anything, okay? And then the next week, I was at MIT and went across the street to the incubator and visited a company that was making flying cars. And you know, not only making flying cars, but having the license to fly flying cars up to 3,000 meters in altitude without a license, using Google's autonomous drive vehicle technology in 3 dimensions. Now, this is science fiction, except that these guys are making it. Toyota's making one. They've just been bought by Geely, who owns Volvo. And we're talking about a rapidly moving emerging industry that could replace urban transportation, taxis and things like that, in which the incumbents have no idea how to even react. If I'm a taxi driver, what do I do? It's unknown. But I have to make decisions nonetheless. So what I'm seeing is a real acceleration of time without the data that I need. In the middle of an S-curve, and remember the S-curves used to be long, it's business as usual. I know what to do and I know how to do it. I might have to make predictions about demand, or I might have to make predictions about capacity, might have to make predictions about cost, but I can do it. I'm good at that. It's decision making under uncertainty. But in between here, I might not know what to do, and I may never be able to do it. And that's the unknown. And the unknown is happening more frequently today because the time periods are compressing. So that means we really need to rethink, how do we make these choices? And how do we build portfolios? Is it possible to have portfolios between long-term and short-term when the short-term is everything and the long-term disappears? You know, how does this work? This is all about variance reduction. This is all about variance enlargement. You build an organizational culture around variance reduction. It's not an organizational culture that allows new ideas to flourish. So how do we make this work within our organizational environment? And not only that, this is no longer just about technologies. So when I put this up and everybody said, yeah, I see this. Remember this? Remember the cassette tape? Remember that? Well, that's not the way it looked at all, right? It more or less looked like that. And you had to use very sophisticated technologies in order to try to get it back. We moved away from the Sony Walkman in part because the customer experience was so bad in retrospect. Had to carry all those tapes around, went all over everything. And we moved to something much neater. These S-curves are about customer experience, and the question is, how much do we know about that when we make the technology choices? And my sense is the people I speak to in R&D and engineering and the like, and I speak as a lapsed engineer, we know very little about those things because we've never had to learn a lot about them in the future. So if that's the case, if the S-curves are changing more frequently than they've ever been, then knowing may no longer be as important as it used to be, but learning becomes much more important. And there I ask you, what are you doing in terms of learning? Being here is a big step forward, right? This is a great thing to do. But how many of your colleagues are at meetings like this? And how many of your colleagues share what they learn at meetings like this? Do you have formal learning processes? Scalable learning becomes more important than scalable efficiency. What does that mean? Well, in the middle of an S-curve, you want to share best practices so that everybody's efficient. But in between an S-curve, when you're dealing with the unknown, you need to share learning because you're going to get a lot of things wrong, and people need to learn from these experiments and from these trials. That's a different mentality. That's a different mindset. That's a different organizational framework. We haven't mastered that very well. What we did in the 20th century was to work with stable efficiency with the expectation of having long S-curves, and we built a push economy where we pushed things out. And as a result, we had organizations that were predictable, hierarchical, had good control, routines, and reduced variance. Those don't work so well when the curves change like that. So we all have a stake in this. It's not just about strategic planning, it's about you and me. Every one of those S-curves means that in some small way, you and I need to reinvent ourselves personally. And our organization needs to be flexible enough to accommodate that. Okay? So we need to, what I want to close on is what we've seen over the 15 years of partnering between my school and MIT. And that is that the funnel, for example, the traditional linear way of thinking about change, that's where we began. Everything we did the first couple of years we worked together was about commercialization. That's not where the action was. We were looking at the wrong place. We were inside out thinking, how do we improve what we do, instead of looking at what was going on outside of the organization. And outside is where the action was. So while we were building stage gate models and better ways of looking financially at our investments in innovation, sometimes resulting in reduction of innovation, all the action was taking place out there. That's where the new ideas were appearing. And so one of the things that I would ask you is when you think about your own organizations, how outside in are you and what are you doing to make that work? And because of the nature of technology transfer, when you think about your clients or your partners, how outside in are they, upstream or downstream? And are you, in fact, moving in a direction that's consistent with the way in which change is taking place, or are you sticking to the routines that you've done in the past? So what we're seeing is increasingly innovation is outside in. It's not about that great idea. It's about somebody's needs and becoming empathetic observers of customers' lives. It's about the customer experience, where whoever the customer is, whether it's your client or partner or customer or supplier or downstream, 2 or 3 links, who's looking for change. And it's more social than technical. And that means we need to be paying more attention to our organizations, our teams. We heard that with the description of how the clusters work. We need to be thinking differently about those things. So the other thing I think we need to be thinking about is how the business model has changed everything. So business model innovation is probably the hottest thing we talk about today. And if you look at this chart, you see familiar disruptors. Everyone from Starbucks who realized that there was a market segment for high-priced coffee, to Apple that was able to put together a value chain that actually populated their devices with everybody's music, to IKEA, which has invited you to build your own products in order to save costs. One of the things that's so interesting is that what these firms have taught us is that I don't need to be technical to disrupt your industry. All I need is a better idea. Amazon knew what nobody else knew. What we had been teaching people for 100 years in business schools is that delivery was not an important part of the retail experience. And Amazon proved that one wrong, right? So what I'm able to do is now I have a whole bunch of ways I can disrupt you. Ryanair is promising free flights in 7 years if they can get a percentage of the increased retail sales at the airports. That's not a bad deal, huh? Airbnb, you all know that story, the largest hospitality company in the world without a single room. So I don't need to hire scarce and expensive scientists and engineers to disrupt you. I can do it by changing delivery time, by changing pricing methods, by changing the way in which we collaborate. That's interesting. It's also interesting for you because what it says is maybe technology transfer is too limited. Maybe we ought to be looking at other types of transfers that work around the business model but have potential impact in the way in which markets change. And finally, it's unlikely that any one organization can do this by yourself. You need partners. The fact is that not only is digital technology blurring industry boundaries, but the ability to change business models and allow and bring the barriers of entry, which used to be based on technology, down much lower, invites other people in. And so we need, I think, to be thinking fresh about this. The one piece that I want to close with one thought, and the one thought is, where do you get your ideas from? So I think that one of the things that would be, that's quite useful, is to reflect on yourself as an innovative entity, as a player in the technology transfer game, and to think about where do you get your ideas from? What do you do with them? I think we have to change behaviors not only at the organizational level and at the team level, but at the individual level as well. What am I doing differently? Is it possible for me to think that this can change the way I get news, photographs, weather, and the like without changing my organization? And the answer is, of course not. But why am I not asking, what about myself? What do I have to change in myself to be able to do this? So I promised 10:30, right? Right on time. And I'm sorry to have done this fast and you know, but I want you to think about these things as you go through the next 2 days. And I wish you well over the next couple of days of meeting. Thank you. Yeah. Thank you. Okay.